Open the pages, step inside. Minds in motion, take the ride. Through the highs, the lows, the fight. Build and strengthen every stride. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go.
So, all right, everybody, welcome to the Sport and Exercise Psychology Book Club and Podcast. My name is David Smith. I am your host today, and I am joined by Dr. Pete Olusoga, who is a BPS chartered psychologist and senior lecturer in psychology at Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. He has spent over 2 decades exploring stress, burnout, well-being, and creating sustainability in high-performance environments. Pete is an internationally recognized researcher in sports psychology and has been an invited speaker, panelist, and host at many sport, health, and well-being events, festivals, and international conferences by giving talks and workshops on topics such as self-care, mindfulness, imposter phenomenon, stress, burnout, psychological well-being, and diversity and inclusion. Peter is a regular guest on BBC Radio's For All in the Mind and is also the producer and host of the award-winning podcast 80% Mental, in which he explores the psychology underpinning performance, sport, health, and well-being with expert guests, one of which was myself. So got to take an appearance on that podcast as well. So look out for our episode. By drawing on his extensive research and work with high-performance sport organizations, Peter focuses on the importance of organizational and cultural change for sustainable well-being, in addition to inclusive, evidence-based strategies that allow individuals to truly thrive. And with that said, we have the most appropriate book that we are discussing today by LA Lakers coach and apparently best-selling author, according to the book, Phil Jackson, discussing his book, The Last Season, A Team in Search of Its Soul. In The Last Season, the summary goes, with the signing of future Hall of Famers Karl Malone and Gary Payton, Los Angeles Lakers fans knew that they were in for another exciting season, but they soon got more than they'd bargained for, including the Kobe Bryant rape case and a nail-biting battle in the finals that brought a heartbreaking end to a season like no other. Nothing, not 6 championships with the Bulls of Michael Jordan and Dennis Rodman, not 3 previous championships with the Lakers of Shaq and Kobe, had prepared coach Phil Jackson for the Hollywood Highwire act of the 2003-2004 season. In the last season, he draws on his trademark honesty and insight to tell the whole explosive story as only he can, from the clash in egos and public feuds to the contract disputes and team meltdowns. A book of tremendous drama and wisdom from a sports icon who writes as well as he coaches. This case study in leadership under duress is a book full of lessons that go far beyond the basketball court. So, Pete, welcome to the podcast, and I appreciate having you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Really looking forward to chatting about the book. And yes, David is right. Go and check out his episode of 80% Mental, which is awesome.
Oh, good to have you on the podcast.
Just got to get that plug in there really early.
Oh, always got to get the plug in, right? So, well, we'll just jump right into it then. What did you think of the book?
So I loved it. I read this book probably about 10 years ago now, and I just what I love about it is it's the coach's perspective on handling like all of the stuff that goes on, in a season. Like, we often see things from the athlete's perspective, and we know that coaches like have a difficult time, but it's written in kind of like a diary format, so we really get to see the sort of inner workings of Coach Phil Jackson's mind throughout the course of an entire season, and it was a pretty turbulent season at that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. That's why I really love reading biographies, especially on not just the athletes themselves, but the coaches, exactly like you said, because it offers a unique insight into just the complexity of coaching. And it doesn't matter if it's a professional sports team or a high performing sports team, or like a high school team or college team or even a kids team. It really shows that there's so much nuance in the way that you develop your relationships with your players, the way that you kind of culture this climate of expectation and performance and a standard of motivation and all these other things in your team, and how do you navigate a lot of this like inter and intra personal complexity and drama sometimes that pops up. And I really thought this was interesting too, because especially we look at, people like Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, and all these
Mhm.
other major players here. We kind of look at them from a pedestal, right? And we see them and we see, for me, I really this last semester with my students, a lot of people shared about how they are inspired by Kobe Bryant's Mamba mentality and all these things like that. But here we actually
Yeah.
get a different insight into who Kobe is as a person from one of the people that had to work closely with him on that front, and especially towards more the beginning of his career rather than later as well. So I found it was super interesting to get those unique perspectives on that very personal and very nuanced and complex, way of navigating team culture and how do you manage everything.
Yeah, I love the fact that, we get to see, like you say, superstars like Kobe Bryant, Shaquille O'Neal, like as human beings, as flawed human beings as well. And Phil Jackson doesn't shy away from that in the book. So, if you're a basketball head like me, like there's lots of kind of technical stuff in there as well. So he kind of talks about game plans and how he handles certain matchups through that 2003, 2004 season. But there's loads in there about those relationships and about dealing with those people, and again dealing with them as human beings, like I say, as flawed human beings, and managing, like you said, those sort of intrapersonal, interpersonal type relationships. So yeah, there's loads in there.
Well, and what I really like too is that it was interesting to balance because you had Shaquille O'Neal, who was at like the very peak of his career, and then you had Kobe Bryant, who was very strong performer, and he was still kind of at the beginning stages of his career, so it's kind of that transition. And Phil talks a lot about how he would have certain games where, because both are very ego-oriented players,
Mhm.
and they tended to clash a lot with each other, and there
Yeah,
was like kind of this rivalry that Phil, I don't want to say he complains about, but you could definitely tell he's kind of annoyed about sometimes, because he's like,
yeah,
come on, y'all, we're on the same team, like let's work together on this. um but he definitely kind of struggles to get them onto the same page and create the buy-in from both of them. There's like a part where he struggles with Shaquille O'Neal because with Shaq, he says, Shaq, I just need you to do like some basic warm-ups before the start of the game because you perform very well in the first and second quarter, but then you're out of steam by the third quarter and you're not
Mhm.
hitting the shots that I need you to hit. And he's like, can you just like walk across the court a couple times in the before or just like something basic, right? She goes like, no, I'm saving myself for the game and stuff. And then he struggles there because then Kobe comes in and he has to say, okay, he kind of has to play these mind games sometimes with them to be
Mm.
able to, like, he goes to the media at one point and he's like, yeah, this is a very Shaq focused game, and he knows that's going to get into Kobe's head on
Yeah,
that. So then he knows the next game it's going to be, oh, here's Kobe's thing. So he has to like navigate the weird complexities of these ego oriented athletes that are not always going to do what he wants them to do, but then be able to, how do you play the game on that front to get them to do what you want them to do by kind of tapping into that ego, but doing it in a weird kind of mind game type of play. And
yeah.
I just found that super interesting because I mean, you are talking about people that are making like millions of dollars here. So how do you get them to buy into all this?
Yeah, well, like one of the themes that comes through quite strongly, I think, is this, he talks all the way through the book about this sort of very like hyper masculine, very much kind of, it's all about the male ego and kind of pandering to the male ego. And these are superstars who kind of need their egos massaged quite a lot.
Mm,
Um, and, you know, I think one of the things that comes through a lot is just the need to have that emotional intelligence as a coach to be able to recognize, when those egos do need massaging and maybe when they need bringing down a notch. And
yeah.
I think something that gets talked about quite a lot in the book, like, is this sort of emotional intelligence of the coach. And there's a couple of examples of him just being intelligent enough to understand like when the relationships that he has with Kobe Bryant are stronger, and perhaps when they're like on the rocks a little bit, but then using other players as well. So there's a couple of examples where, he's sitting in there and Horace Grant's in the room. I think I can't remember whether it's after a game or before a game, but Horace Grant's in the room and Kobe's complaining about something or other, and like Coach Phil Jackson just turns to Horace and says, "Horace, are you hearing this?"
Yeah.
And it's just kind of that open question thrown to one of the veteran players who's been around and seen it all and done it all. And he's kind of like getting other players' perspective in a very sort of kind of I guess sort of roundabout sort of way.
Kind of like
Um
puts him on the spot a little bit. Not
it kind
not
of,
not Horace, but Kobe. Mhm.
yeah, exactly. All right. So it's like he's not saying anything specifically as the coach. He's just bringing in other veteran players' opinions and voices in a very natural way. And there's a couple of examples of when he does that throughout the season.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how they respond to that, right? Because it's very specific. I mean, like you said, it's in one situation it could be like you said, take down the ego a notch, right? But on the other times, it's kind of like, okay, here's how we massage it to get that performance out. And what
Mm,
was interesting too is the fact that he was navigating all this on top of like Kobe Bryant's rape case from
yeah.
the 2003 rape case as well. So he had to deal with the fact that like, okay, Kobe's not always going to be available. He has to travel to Colorado for these court cases. How does he as a coach resolve his own relationship with Kobe given the context of the case? I know he doesn't really like go into too much details on that front. He kind of just sets it off to the side. But I
Yeah.
mean, how do you deal with that? Because it's obviously a huge emotional fallout for Kobe in a lot of ways as
Yeah.
well. Regardless of how the case actually develops, he has to go to court, he has to do all these extra travels, it's all this extra stress, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. So how does that affect his performance? And then that adds another layer of whole complexity there on Phil's shoulders to say,
Mm.
okay, well, how do I navigate that as well?
Well, I think, I think that changes throughout the course of the season. It changes throughout the course of the books. I think kind of early on, he talks about this kid, Kobe Bryant, because he is only a kid at the time. I think he must be like early 20s,
Yeah, like
something like that. So, I mean,
19, 20, 21.
yeah, so he'd already won three championships by that point. So he was kind of like considered a veteran player, but he's still quite a young kid. And, Phil Jackson talks about him in the book saying he may be an athlete, but he's also a very vulnerable human being. All right. And again, it's just sort of demonstrating that relationship with players is more than just coach and athlete. It's kind of understanding that these are people that I'm dealing with, and they're, like we said right at the start, they're kind of flawed human beings as well. But it kind of changes throughout the course of the season, throughout the course of the book, where at the start he's very, very much kind of giving Kobe a lot of rope, understanding the situation, like giving him a lot of leeway, letting a lot of things go. But then there's a kind of tipping point, I think, as it gets towards the playoffs, where he's like, okay, maybe maybe I've given too much here. Maybe we need to have kind of a serious conversation about like I'm going to need a bit more from you. I'm going to need you to be kind of the professional. So again, it's just showing that sort of understanding of what's needed in that relationship, but how that can be dynamic and can change throughout the course of a season. So I think, yeah, that again, that sort of emotional intelligence of the
Mhm.
coach and understanding players, understanding that they're humans, but I need to handle that relationship in a certain way, and that might change.
And that's what I really liked about one of the ongoing themes, especially with Phil in this whole saga, was that level of professionalism, right? So actually going up and saying, okay, he had to have a few of those discussions with Kobe and be able to say, I need you need to be professional. Yes, you are good and a strong player and you're all these things, but it doesn't mean anything if you cannot act as a professional within
Mm,
this setting, right? There's one point where I don't exactly remember what the incident was, but Kobe, he was in the locker room and he was, throwing a whole fit, right? And he was screaming and yelling and saying all these like nasty things, just kind of, letting loose some tension and energy. But it was like, you go into the locker room afterwards and it's a whole hot mess and disaster. And it's like, okay, you need to be professional here. Remember, these are your other teammates that were
mm,
there as well. Like Phil was not in the locker room at the time, but some of his other teammates were. And it's how does that not only affect you, but how does that affect the team? as
Mm.
well, and had to create that kind of discussion of, remember, this is a team sport, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think it was I think somebody had said something in the press, and he was kind of going around and trying to find out who had said it, who had said it. And I think it was one of the
Yeah.
other players actually was like, Kobe, just you're gonna have to let it go. You're gonna have
Did
to
you
let it
say it?
drop.
Did you say it? Like,
Yeah.
calm down, dude. Like, yeah. So, I mean, what are your thoughts then on with that? Because Phil came from the Shark, like the famous '90s Michael Jordan era of the Chicago Bulls, right? So,
Hmm.
like classic, Michael Jackson, or not Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, flying through the air. I mean, it was
Yeah.
the '90s, right? There was so much going on there with Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan and Macaulay Culkin, and but so the Chicago Bulls under Phil Jackson were very high performing, very cohesive, very
Hmm.
you know tight knit team, and they were just so dominant on so many fronts. And of course, he brought that same culture into the Lakers, and then he was successful for 3 out of the 4 seasons to win a championship with the Lakers. What happened? Do you think? Like, I mean, the book explains obviously there was a lot of changes, or maybe lack of changes that
Hmm.
happened in that last season, where they went from a high performing team to just completely collapsing. But what do you like? What are some of the factors on that front that really stood out to you?
Well, I think what's interesting then, you mentioned the Chicago Bulls there and their sort of, the big, I guess, philosophy of the Chicago Bulls was this idea of buying into the idea of the team, right? Of the sort of oneness of the team. And I think like I don't think that was ever the case in LA. I don't think that was ever the case with the Lakers. I think you had Shaq, who was the most like Lakers early Lakers Shaq was unstoppable,
Yeah.
unguardable. Like you could not beat him. And then you had this kid Kobe Bryant, and then you had like a role players all around them who were like excellent in what they did. So like I think that their talent took them through those 3 championships rather than any kind of like oneness or unity, because there was always those clashes with Shaq and Kobe. They clashed from the kind of the get go. So I think it was like a very different approach, and you can see throughout this book, he's trying to develop that sort of oneness and getting them to sort of buy into this idea of kind of unity, and it's never quite there. It's never quite there. And I think like after those first 3 championships, because Shaq was the MVP and Kobe was the sidekick, and Kobe was sick of being the sidekick and he didn't want to
Yeah.
be the sidekick. And I think he
Always
talks
the
about that.
bridesmaid, never the bride.
Right, exactly right. And I think like that kind of came to a head a little bit. And obviously they'd been knocked out the year before, so they'd won 3 straight finals, then got knocked out, and then this book is the story of the year they went back to the championship, but ultimately lost. Um, but I think by that point, those clashes of egos had kind of just set in, and it was always just going to go one way. They might have been that their talent might have got them through, and they obviously got to the final, so they came close. But I think, regardless of what had happened, I think that was kind of the end of that Lakers dynasty, the end of the Shaq and Kobe relationship.
Yeah, I mean, because you have that issue with the All-Star syndrome, right? Where you become so reliant on you have such a strong performing player that
Mm,
it feels like it's unstoppable, and it's really kind of a flimsy facade in a lot of ways that only holds up for so long before it really gets challenged and pushed. And that's definitely one of those things that really stood out to me, right? Because like you said, in the first like 3 seasons, it was very strong. They were able to rely on that a lot, but then something like that, it becomes so fallible because eventually, yeah, maybe in the
mm,
very beginning, Shaquille O'Neal was unstoppable, right? But then as he gets older, they start to figure out, okay, here's how we can play around him. Here's how we can, you know, go up against him, right? Because especially I love this in sport. Everything is fallible, right? Every tactic is
mm,
fallible. Every team is fallible. Every player is fallible in one way or another. It just is how creative are you in in understanding that fallibility and then taking action to exploit it, right? And
yeah.
so at this point, okay, after 3 seasons of championships, these other teams are going to figure out, okay, how do we play against Shaq, right? And then Kobe comes in as well, and he's of course a completely different player. and completely maybe changes the dynamic of that team as well. But then at the same time, it's that lack of a relationship, that lack of team cohesion, that lack of we're here as a group, let's
Mm.
actually work together on this. As much as maybe they hate each other off court, it's the fact that hatred for each other, or maybe that not maybe not hatred but tension and
Mm.
disinterest in each other, it translates itself onto the court as well, to the point where
Yeah.
they end up missing a lot of potential opportunities to really score, to really hit a higher level of performance there than they might otherwise would have, had they actually maybe set aside their egos for the game itself, right? And that was always
Yeah.
interesting to me, because you see, like, there's career rivals in sports and in all sorts of fields, right? There's always rivals, but it's that professionalism of, okay, when it's game time, you have to kind of set that aside sometimes, because as much as maybe we hate each other, we do work well together. We're both high performing, so we can we
Hmm.
can play that, right? But yeah, if there's no cohesion there, if there's no real resilient sense of communication and teamwork, it doesn't matter, right? Because
But yeah, I think what's interesting though is, that sort of difference between like task cohesion and social cohesion. So like, can we get on enough to actually perform well versus like, do we like each other? And, not only have we got Shaq and Kobe, but you've also got like Karl Malone, who, was a superstar in Utah. You got Gary Payton, who's a superstar in Seattle, and they're coming towards the end of their careers. So they're also having to sacrifice kind of what they want their role maybe to be and do kind of different things. Right. So you've got this kind of group of players who are all having to kind of change their games a little bit, right? And again, one of the things that Phil Jackson says in the book on this is like as long as you respect each other for what you do in your work, then you can go out and play together, right? So players liking one another isn't mandatory, but it's helpful,
yeah,
but it's not mandatory. So I was kind of thinking, like from a psychologist point of view, like what would I be doing in order to sort of try and foster that little bit of cohesion. And there's a couple of things that he actually does in the book as a coach, So I think right at the start of the season, he kind of gets everybody around and asks them to say something in an initial meeting, kind of like, why are they there? And this is this like personal disclosure and mutual sharing. You come across that, the PDMS, yeah. We kind
something
of
like that. Yeah.
get everybody kind of in the team to sort of say like, okay, well, whatever it might be. But in this case, it's like, why are you there? Like, what's the purpose of you being here? And just that sort of little bit of sharing can sometimes like really build that cohesion early on. So he kind of did it at the start of the season. And I think he came back to it in the playoffs as well and did kind of a similar type exercise.
Yeah.
But that was about it. Well, in terms of what was mentioned anyway. So I was just thinking like, how do we foster that cohesion with a bunch of massive egos
Yeah.
in that
Well,
situation? And we
and
just
I'm
want them to kind
honestly
of
kind of
play as one.
surprised that he didn't do more to
Yeah.
foster cohesion like that. I mean, I would expect a coach with his tenure to actually have that kind of consideration in mind. But like you said, it was only once at the beginning of the season and then maybe once at the playoffs. And the whole time I'm reading this thing, and I'm sitting here wondering, like, have you done any group exercises to foster communication, or
Yeah.
just develop teamwork? I mean, like, are you just going to a basketball court and shooting basketballs every day? Like, what are you doing here?
Hmm. Yeah. I guess it's tricky in that 82 game season where you're on the road and you're traveling and like how much time do you have to spend on those sorts of things. But then again, it comes back to that age old thing of, well, like how important is psychology underpinning performance, and then how
Yeah.
much time are you spending on that as opposed to like other things. But yeah, just kind of interesting again, sort of reading through that, and I think there was a sense of almost resignation. And again, it's kind of another one of the themes of the book, and kind of fills big into like mindfulness and meditation and acceptance. And there was a sort of a kind of theme of letting a lot of things go. Like I
Mhm.
can't control any of this, so
Yeah.
I'm just gonna let this go.
Well, and that was one of the things that stood out to me as well, is that he takes, I mean, he does do a lot of sports psychology on that front, right?
Yeah.
If you go back to one of his earlier books, I think Sacred Hoops, he talks a lot about that as well, on how he kind of was inspired and developed a lot of the stuff. But he does group meditation, mindfulness exercises. He encourages open dialogue. He wants his athletes to speak up and talk about what's going on. So
Hmm.
he's really tried to create this environment of psychological safety and on all these things to help, keep everybody relaxed and calm. So it's interesting because he does that, right? He does
Hmm.
utilize sports like what we would now call sports psychology. He utilizes a lot of these principles, things like that. But he just, I don't know, maybe he was us off the mark a little bit there on what the team really needed in terms of on that front. And I know I feel like you said, there's a lot of things he just said, okay, I cannot control this. I'm going to step back. But I feel like maybe he could have done a little more, or there were some things where maybe he could have maybe not made a full intervention, but could have
Hmm.
responded to in ways that could have been a little bit more helpful or productive. But I mean, this is of
Yeah.
course all in, retrospect, of course. We have no idea how that would actually worked.
Yeah, and I don't want to second guess arguably one of the greatest basketball coaches in history,
Yeah, yeah,
but I
exactly.
think like things like there's a point where he kind of got everybody meditating before, I think it was like before the playoffs, and it was, and again, we don't know how much because it's only whatever is written in the book,
Right.
but it felt like it was kind of just a one-off thing. And he said like I don't know if anyone's going to buy into it, but I don't know if it's going to do any good. Maybe it might do some good for some of the players, but not. But you get the sense that it was kind of thrown in there as a bit of a, oh, well, let's try this because I know it's worked. Something that he did regularly again with the Chicago Bulls. Um, and you think,
Something
well,
that
like,
should have been regular with the Lakers, but wasn't doing it
exactly
for
right.
us.
Exactly. So you think, like, well, would that have helped if that had been like a regular thing that they'd done? And again, I don't know whether it was or wasn't, but it seemed like it wasn't. Um, Again, it's kind of that sort of, you talked about in the Chicago Bulls, you would get the players all kind of just breathing as one, right? And just kind of, again, it's that sense of all being kind of one unit. Yeah, so you just wonder kind of things like that. Maybe more of that stuff.
And I wonder why he stopped doing that with the Lakers. Because if he was doing that with the Bulls and he saw obviously great results,
I
why
think
did
I
he stop
think
doing that?
I think he's probably just sick of their shit.
Yeah, right. It's like, okay, let's just get this.
Yeah.
By the end of your career, you're just like, all right, just counting the days until retirement. Yeah. So I would say that what are your top takeaways from this book? Is a maybe as a sport and exercise practitioner or psychology practitioner, or just as a person in general, anything, top
Uh,
takeaways.
I mean, we just kind of touched on this idea of letting go of a lot of things. And there's one example that stood out, and it was with Gary Payton, who coming from Seattle, and again, kind of an older player. And he was sulking a little bit for some reason, and he kind of turned up late to one of the games, or one of the practices. And in the book, Phil Jackson just says like, um, I didn't I didn't pry. He didn't offer an explanation. I didn't ask for an explanation. Like maybe it was a protest because he didn't get enough playing time. And he said, I'd go crazy if I were to speculate about that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So, we talked right at the start about the emotional intelligence of kind of understanding what players' needs are and how they might change throughout the season. But there's also that aspect of controlling what you can control and kind of accepting what you can't control and just sort of, there's no point in me kind of pursuing this. There's no point in this, in having this discussion or having this argument because it's not going to go anywhere. So I can just step back from it. And I can just let that one go. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff like that. But I think like for me, the key takeaway is getting to see like the course of a whole season from this coaching perspective. And we get to see the coach as a human being as well, which we often don't see. We kind of see the coach as this person who's just in charge of these bunch of sort of egos.
Mhm.
But the coach is judged on performance. Coach is always judged on performance, and they're judged on the performance of other players, right? So Phil Jackson's season as a coach is judged on Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal and whether they win a championship or not. And because they didn't win a championship, that season's seen as a failure. I mean, the fact that they won 3 in 5 years, made the playoffs every time, got to the finals one year, Eastern Conference Finals the year before. Like, that's still not seen as good enough. Um, but if we think about like how coaches' performance can be measured or could be measured, like he's taken two bickering superstars, a bunch of aging players who have injuries. So Karl Malone was injured throughout the playoffs, injured during the season, missed a lot of games. You know, one of your superstars is involved in a court case and is kind of flying in and making games, like arriving an hour before games. You've got a bunch of rookies who's trying to develop as well. And if you think about it, Luke Walton, one of the rookies, he went on to win 2 championships and then went on to become a coach as well. So it's like,
Right.
are we judging this season as a success or a failure based on whether you've won a championship or not?
Yeah.
And coaches are often evaluated on those sort of wins and losses, but there are much more subjective measures of coaching that, maybe we could consider, like maybe organizations could consider. Especially when we think about the cost of coach turnover, right? Well, that season was a bust. We'll get a new one. And what happened was they didn't renew Phil Jackson's contract. He sat a year out, and then they asked him to come back a year later,
Yeah, you're right.
and he won 2 more championships, and a couple of years after that. So it's like the cost of staff turnover, the impact on coaches' well-being. A lot of my stuff's on coach well-being. I think getting to see the coach as a human and understanding like how we might judge that coaching performance is something that we can really, really take from this.
And that's, I think, really important because, it's easy for us just to look at pure wins and losses or some basic statistics and say, okay, this was a great season or a bad season, right? But like you said, it's the subjective aspects of the performance. I mean, how do you balance two superstar egos plus, a team of either retiring players or rookies, right? And how do you navigate through all this, especially after coming off of 3 winning seasons, and then a season where you made it to the I think made it to the championships and then lost as how it went. But just trying to reset and then keep going with a lot of the same things that hopefully brought you to that. But at the same time, like, because maybe they won those seasons in the past means that everybody's mentality is different. Everything has changed. So then how do you adapt to that as well? And that's the critical, I think, takeaway for me is how do you adapt relative to the circumstances as they're playing out, right? Because now in this season, there's a lot of differences, right? There's the court case, and then there's, maybe in the first season or two, I mean, I don't know, because obviously I read that book yet, but Kobe was, I would assume, less ego in the beginning when his first season or his second season.
I'm pretty sure he always had a massive ego.
Oh yeah, but when he's first starting out, right? It's a little bit it's a little bit like easier to kind of maintain, right? But then after a while, it's like, okay, it really starts to grow. So his ego is definitely getting bigger, and then Shaq is, he's getting older, right? So he can't perform at the level that he used to perform, but he probably still has that level of ego as well. And then so how do you navigate through all that, right? And then yeah, just all this craziness as it happens, right? And the pressure of these coaches that they're put under, because as you said, if they're not winning, they're going to get fired next season, right? And this was for me a big takeaway, not just in this book, but whenever I read like when I read Bill Walsh's book that I talked about in a previous episode, things like that, is that at this level of sport, it's a pressure cooker for everybody. It's a pressure cooker for the athletes. It's a pressure cooker for the coaches and everything like that. And it's, if you don't perform at the level that, the owners and the managers want you to, you're out, right? There's no sense of real career stability or long-term growth on a lot of these fronts where, yeah, maybe we do have, coaches that end up going for 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, with a single team, but that's more rare than anything else because, as much as you, like you said, oh, the cost of staff turnover is high. For whatever reason, though, they can't see okay, this is we're playing the long game here, right? And it
Yeah.
was interesting because as you were sharing that, it made me think of Bill Walsh's book, right? Because he took over the 49ers, which was the worst team in the world, and then the next season when he took it over, he had the same performance versus of win losses with the 49ers that they had in the previous season. So they were still losing as bad as they had lost before. And he's sitting here thinking, oh, I'm going to get fired. I'm going to get fired. Right. But then he's looking at, okay, let's actually look at the points that we gained as a team. Let's actually look at the individual, like, player performance, how many more like runs did we get? So even though the wins and losses were the same as the
Mhm.
previous season, the team performed a lot better that
Yeah.
season, and actually had a stronger performance, which, it says, okay, well, if you're taking the worst team in the world and you're going to want to make them the best team, you have to do that over like a 5 year plan, not a 5 week plan or a 5 month plan, right?
Yeah.
And so in this case, it's the same thing, right? It's here. He had 3 wins with the Lakers after a huge winning tenure with the Bulls. Okay, now he's lost a couple of seasons. One, which was he made it to the championships and still lost, but still being able to actually say, well, look at all this shit that I had to deal with. It's a miracle that we even made it this far, right? And then as you
Yeah.
said, okay, so sure they fire him, but then they realize, oh crap, this guy's actually kind of good. And turns out the new guy we hired is even worse. So let's see if we can bring him back, right? Yeah. Professional sport, I think, is very interesting like that, just kind of in a case study in general. That's why I love reading these kind of books and getting
Yeah.
this perspective. So I'll be interested to see because this is the first of Phil Jackson's book that I've read, and I know he's got a whole kind of series that chronicles different periods of his career. So being able to
Mhm.
kind of look back and see kind of how it's all developed previously for him, but also to be able to read like Kobe Bryant's books and Shaquille O'Neal's books and Malone's books and all these other people that were under his guidance as a coach to get
Yeah.
see if we can get the same story from their perspective as well, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's yeah, it's a strange world, sport, and the way that the performance is judged. Um, and again, it's just because there's always a bottom line, right? There's always a bottom line. But I think we can just be a little bit more careful because the media is going to say what the media is going to say because the media needs to sell stories. All right. But I think we can just be a little bit more thoughtful about how we're judging performance. So owners and leaders in sports organizations, like thinking about performance and what measures of performance are perhaps important is something to think about.
Indeed. So yeah. Well, is there any other thoughts or anything else that you'd like to share about the book?
No, I think like the only other thing that I would say is again that one of the other sort of major themes that came out was around, and again it goes back to that sort of level of emotional intelligence, but it's about one of the greatest coaches of all time talking about just fostering relationships with the athletes that he's working with and seeing them as human beings, like we said right at the start. And there's so many examples of when he's bringing players into the decision making, but also understanding like when that's appropriate and when that's less appropriate. Right. So during the season, I'm going to give you lots of responsibility. I'm going to give you kind of time to figure things out. When it comes to playoff time, right? I'm the big I am, right? I'm the one that's making the decisions. But again, like saying that up front so that they know that that's going to happen, so it doesn't come as a surprise. But I think thinking about that long haul of 82 games, like over a whole season, giving the players that chance to learn how to work together. Understanding that that period before Christmas is always going to be difficult. So rather than kind of trying to push them harder, like, well, I'm actually going to ease off a little bit here. Right?
Yeah.
It's finding the pulse of the team, I guess, and sort of being responsive to that rather than just, well, I'm going to do it my way because this is the way that I think it should be done. Being
Right.
responsive and being reactive and kind of really, really understanding that pulse. So, So I think, yeah, in terms of themes from this book, that's the only other thing that I would sort of draw out from that I think is useful or important to maybe chat about.
Yeah, definitely. So, and Pete, where can people find you on social media, online? How can they connect with you?
So probably the easiest thing is either on Instagram at Dr. underscore Pete dot. Well, do that bit again. Don't know my own social media handle. On Instagram, I'll just say okay.
I'm gonna put the social media stuff on the show
Yeah,
notes so you can connect
so
on it.
so at Instagram at 80percentmental.com or oh, fuck my life. I don't know my own. Right, I'm going to do that bit again. You can edit all that out. So on Instagram at 80% mental, probably the easiest place to go. And you can find kind of links to everything else through there, or the website 80percentmental.com, which again has got links to all the podcast episodes. But all of my kind of details are on there as well. So if people want to reach out and get in touch, they can do so through those places.
Sounds fabulous. And yeah, definitely make sure you check out our episode as well because we cover a lot of shit. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining me. It was a fabulous discussion and
No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Open the pages, step inside. Minds in motion, take the ride. Through the highs, the lows, the fight. Build and strengthen every stride. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. We talk, we share, we find the way. Fuel the fire every day. Books and voices light the spark. Chasing goals and leaving marks. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. Move the mind, feel it grow. Sport and soul in the flow. Dream it big, let it show. To the peak we're set to go. To the peak we're set to go.